The moment my dad asked, "Where is your car?" my blood ran cold, not because I did not know the answer, but because I knew exactly what that question was really about. My hands started shaking. My chest felt like it was about to explode. Behind me, my husband and his mother stood silently, watching, waiting. For weeks, they had been plotting. And now, my own father had just walked right into their trap. I forced my face to stay calm, swallowed the scream clawing at my throat. Because this was not just about a car. This was the moment everything changed. And the revenge I'd been quietly planning was about to begin. My name is Elaine Carter, and I am 58 years old. I have lived a life that many would call ordinary, yet beneath the surface. I carried the weight of years filled with sacrifices, unspoken struggles, and quiet resilience. I raised my son alone after his father walked out when he was 12. I worked double shifts, sometimes sleeping on the couch for hours just to make sure he had everything he needed. I thought I had done everything right. I thought my loyalty, my love, my blood, sweat, and tears earned me respect. I was wrong. The people who should have supported me were the very ones who made me feel invisible. My husband, a man I had married later in life, had always seemed considerate at first. He whispered the right words, smiled at the right moments. But his true colors, along with those of his mother, were hidden beneath a veneer of charm and politeness. They were cunning, manipulative, and insidious. And they were about to remind me of just how powerless I appeared. Our home had been a quiet battlefield. My husband, Richard, was obsessed with control. My son, Michael, and I had clashed many times over trivial matters, but nothing compared to what was coming. The house, which I had considered my sanctuary, began to feel like a cage. I noticed the subtle ways they undermined me, questions about what I owned, remarks about how I managed my life, even passive-aggressive comments about my parenting. Every smile from them felt like a trap. Every conversation a carefully orchestrated reminder that I no longer belonged here the way I once had. It was a rainy Tuesday when the confrontation began. I remember the sound of the rain tapping against the windows as I stepped out of my car, exhausted from a long day at work. Michael, my son, met me at the door with a tight expression I had never seen on him before. He did not greet me. He did not hug me. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made my stomach twist. "Where's your car?" he asked. The question should have been simple, harmless even, but it hit me like a punch I did not see coming. My mind raced, my pulse spiking as I realized this was not curiosity or concern. This was a challenge. A test. My husband and his mother have been pressuring me, I said slowly, careful with my words, careful not to ignite a war I was not ready for. They want me to give it to them. Michael's eyes narrowed, and the silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the tension in the air as thick as the storm outside. Something in him shifted, something I had not seen since he was a child. It was as if I had suddenly been stripped bare in front of a jury that I could not plead to. Richard and his mother, Margaret, had always been calculating. I had known from the beginning that they would try to control more than just my finances or possessions. They wanted influence, dominance, a way to bend me to their will. And in that moment, I realized just how much they had succeeded. I was being cornered in the house I had once thought of as mine. The car was only the beginning. I could feel my hands shaking, but my voice stayed calm. That calm scared me more than their anger ever could. I nodded, even smiled, though inside I felt the sharp sting of betrayal and humiliation. I had built this home, raised my son, and somehow it felt like I was being pushed out of my own life. The rain outside intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the windows. It mirrored my inner turmoil. Every drop seemed to echo the questions running through my mind. How did it come to this? How could my own family betray me so thoroughly? And most importantly, what could I do to reclaim control? I walked through the living room, tracing my fingers over surfaces I had polished 1,000 times. Each object, each photo, each piece of furniture reminded me of what I had built, And what was at stake? They did not see me as the woman who had raised her child alone, who had endured heartbreak, who had fought every day to maintain dignity. They saw weakness. They saw opportunity. But I had not reached the end of my rope. Not yet. Something inside me shifted as I realized that this was not just about a car or even this house. This was about respect, about justice, about proving to them and to myself that I was not someone to be toyed with, overlooked, or dismissed. I remember thinking, even as I made small talk with Michael later that evening, that the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to rise inside me. Every slight, every manipulation, every whispered demand had laid the groundwork for something bigger, something inevitable. And I was ready to face it. Even as I sipped my tea that night, my mind spun with possibilities, strategies, and scenarios. Every move they had made against me became a piece of the puzzle I was beginning to see clearly. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the scales of power could be balanced, but only if I acted, only if I played the long game, and only if I allowed no emotion to cloud my judgment. As I stared at my reflection in the window, rain streaking the glass, I would make them regret underestimating me. I would show them that years of sacrifice, resilience, and quiet intelligence were not to be dismissed. And when the moment came, the payoff would be sweet, deliberate, and unforgettable. If you have ever felt powerless, overlooked, or betrayed by those who should have stood by you, hit that like button and subscribe. This story is not just about revenge. It's about taking back control, reclaiming respect, and showing that no one can underestimate you without facing consequences. Watch closely, because every detail counts, and the moment of justice is closer than you think. The days that followed were a delicate dance of manipulation, intimidation, and quiet war. Richard and his mother, Margaret, never confronted me directly again about the car. No, they were far more cunning than that. Their attacks were subtle, invisible to anyone who did not know me as well as they did. Comments dropped casually, designed to make me doubt myself. A glance that lingered too long. A tone that suggested criticism without words. Every interaction left a bitter residue, a reminder that they were testing me, probing for weakness. I remember the morning I went to the kitchen and found my favorite coffee mug gone. Margaret smiled as she handed it to me, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Oh, I just thought this belonged with the others in the cabinet," she said, her voice soft, almost sweet. But it was a trap. She wanted to remind me that even the smallest things were no longer mine. That everything I cherished was up for inspection and control. I felt the sting of humiliation, though I kept my expression calm. Richard escalated in a different way. He began to question my decisions openly, not quietly like his mother. He would suggest that I was incapable of managing the household, that I could not even handle simple tasks without guidance. Every sentence he uttered was a calculated jab, every sigh a subtle accusation. The house, once my sanctuary, now felt like a minefield. I could not move without being watched, judged, or undermined. I tried to speak to Michael about it, hoping he would see reason. I reminded him of everything we had been through together, the life we had built. But even he had started to take their side in small ways, echoing phrases Margaret had planted in his mind. "Maybe they are right, Mom," he said once, his voice hesitant but unsettling. It felt like betrayal, but I knew better. He was only young enough to be influenced, and they were experts at manipulation. Each day brought a new tension, a new test. I noticed small things missing from my routines, minor inconveniences arranged just to frustrate me. A misplaced set of keys, a forgotten delivery. A canceled appointment I had made weeks in advance. Nothing catastrophic, yet everything cumulative. I could feel my frustration growing like a silent fire, simmering just beneath the surface. One evening, I found Richard and Margaret laughing softly in the living room while I carried laundry upstairs. Their laughter stopped abruptly when they noticed me, but the look they exchanged spoke volumes. They were allies in a game I did not fully understand, but I was beginning to see the pattern. They thrived on control, on dominance, on the subtle erosion of my authority in my own home, and yet I did not react immediately. I observed. I catalogued. I noted every inflection, every glance, every step they took to undermine me. The psychological weight was unbearable at times. I began waking up in the middle of the night, heart racing, replaying every interaction, every comment, every slight. I felt trapped in my own mind, like a chess piece under constant surveillance. Yet even in that darkness, a part of me was alive with resolve. I realized that if I allowed myself to crumble, they would have won completely. That thought fueled me, sharpened my awareness, and forced me to plan silently in the corners of my mind. Margaret began leaving little reminders of her influence everywhere, a note suggesting I was forgetful, a call to Michael implying that I had mishandled a simple errand. Richard joined in by questioning my judgment in front of neighbors or family friends. Every interaction was designed to isolate me, to make me question my own competence and self-worth. And every time I forced myself to remain calm, I felt the tide of my anger rising. It was during one particularly tense dinner that I understood just how far they would go. Richard refused to allow me to serve the dishes in the order I preferred. Margaret made subtle comments about my cooking, praising me when it suited them, but immediately highlighting mistakes afterward. Michael sat silently watching us, and I felt a pang of sadness. I realized that they had managed to turn him into an observer of my humiliation, someone too intimidated to defend me. I could feel the pressure building, the storm inside me reaching a point that demanded action. But I knew I could not react impulsively. Every detail I observed, every slight they inflicted became part of the strategy forming in my mind. I was no longer just reacting, I was preparing. One night, after another long day of subtle manipulations and silent jabs, I stood by the window and watched the rain streak down the glass. It mirrored my thoughts, chaotic, relentless, and filled with a promise of inevitable change. I realized that I was not powerless. I was observant. I was patient. And they had underestimated me in every possible way. That realization sparked something I had not felt in years, a cold, calculated determination. Their games, their manipulations, and their attempts to control me had revealed a weakness I could exploit. I was no longer just surviving their tactics. I was beginning to see the path to reclaiming everything they had taken from me, the respect, the control, and the dignity that was rightfully mine. And deep down, I knew the moment was approaching when everything they had done would come back to them, in ways they could never anticipate. The quiet storm I had nurtured within myself was ready to break, and when it did, it would be unforgettable. I remember the exact moment I realized I could no longer stay silent. It was a Thursday evening, the house suffused with the low hum of the heater and the scent of something Richard had burned in the kitchen. I had just returned from work, exhausted, hoping for a quiet dinner, a moment of peace. Instead, I walked into a scene that made my chest tighten and my stomach knot with anger. Richard and Margaret were sitting together, leaning close, whispering in tones just loud enough for me to hear. Their laughter was sharp, deliberate. They were dissecting me again, evaluating my reactions like predators circling prey. Margaret smirked as she mentioned the car incident. The way I had hesitated, the subtle tremor in my voice that betrayed my fear. Richard nodded, clearly savoring every word. My hands clenched at my sides, my teeth ground together. I could feel my pulse in my ears, every beat a warning. Rage bubbled like molten lava beneath my calm exterior. I wanted to shout, to slam the table, to shake them until they understood how much power they had taken from me. But I did not. I breathed slowly, focusing on each inhale and exhale, counting the seconds, reminding myself that losing control would only feed them. Michael sat across from them, glancing at me briefly, and I caught the conflict in his eyes. He had begun to see the cracks in their behavior, the cruelty hidden beneath smiles. And yet he remained hesitant, unsure where his loyalties should lie. I wanted to reach out to him, to pull him into my corner, But even that moment of connection felt out of reach. The divide they had created in our home was deeper than I had realized. That night, I went to my room and closed the door behind me, leaning against it until the world outside stopped spinning. I could hear faint laughter drifting from the living room, a sound that once would have been comforting, now unbearable. I sank onto the edge of my bed, gripping the sheets, and I thought about everything I had endured, the quiet erosion of respect, the endless manipulations, the subtle and not so subtle reminders that I was no longer in control. A memory surfaced, sharp and unforgiving. The years I had poured into my son, the nights I had stayed awake while he slept safely, the sacrifices I had made to ensure he had everything he needed, now being undermined by people who had no right to interfere in my life. My blood boiled. I realized that this was not just about a car, a dinner, or a few cruel words. This was about my life, my dignity, and my sense of justice. I stood up abruptly, pacing the room as the anger surged. Every plan, every strategy I had vaguely considered in the past began to crystallize. I realized that I could not continue to live like this, constantly reacting to their games, constantly feeling powerless. I needed to take control, and I needed to do it deliberately, methodically, in a way that would ensure they could never manipulate me again. The thought of revenge was not born of childish spite. It was born of necessity, of a clear-eyed understanding that the scales had been tipped too far for too long. I allowed myself a small, grim smile as I imagined their surprise when they realized that I had been quietly observing, cataloging, and planning all along. Every small slight, every manipulation, every attempt to belittle me had been a thread in the web I was beginning to weave. I opened my journal, something I had kept for years but had rarely used in moments of crisis. I began writing down every slight, every insult, every incident that had chipped away at my authority. Each note felt like a spark, fueling a fire that had been smoldering quietly for weeks. By the time I closed the journal, I felt a strange calm, a sense of clarity I had not experienced in months. I was no longer merely reacting. I was strategizing. I was preparing. That night, I lay awake, imagining different scenarios, plotting moves and countermoves. Every angle, every weakness, every opportunity was considered. I pictured Richard's smug expression when he thought he had one, Margaret's self-satisfied smirk as she undermined me, and the satisfaction I would feel when it all unraveled in a way they could not anticipate. The anticipation alone sent a shiver through me, a mix of fear, excitement, and resolve. By the time dawn crept through the blinds, I had reached a conclusion. I would not allow them to dominate me any longer. I would reclaim my home, my respect, and my sense of self. But I would do it carefully. I would be patient. I would wait for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, they would not see it coming. I understood for the first time that true power came not from anger or confrontation alone, but from strategy, observation, and timing. I could feel the weight of the upcoming battle pressing on me, but I also felt a surge of anticipation. They had underestimated me. They had assumed I was broken, submissive, and weak. That mistake would be their downfall. As I watched the sunrise, casting pale light across the room, I felt a strange sense of peace amid the storm inside me. I was no longer a victim. I was a strategist. I was a force they had never imagined. And in the quiet of that morning, I allowed myself to whisper one thought, sharp and certain. Their games end soon, and when they do, I will be ready. I began quietly. Not with confrontation, not with emotion, with preparation. It's the kind of preparation that happens in silence, where no one notices a shift until it is already too late to stop it. The first thing I did was regain control of information. I reviewed every document I owned: property papers, bank statements, insurance policies, vehicle ownership records. Everything that connected my name to authority, stability, and power. I sat at the dining table late at night, the house asleep, the lamp casting a single circle of light over my paperwork, like a spotlight in a courtroom. What I found made my heart pound. The house was legally mine. The car was legally mine. The savings account Richard liked to reference was mostly funded by my income. Margaret had been speaking as if everything already belonged to them, but the truth was brutally simple. On paper, they owned nothing. That realization felt like oxygen after drowning. But power meant nothing without timing, so I waited. I started watching them more closely. I noted when Margaret made phone calls. I listened when Richard complained about finances. I saw how confident they were, how careless their arrogance made them. They believed I was still confused, still afraid, still submissive. That belief became my greatest weapon. I began acting smaller, quieter, more compliant. I nodded more. I apologized when they criticized me. I pretended to accept their version of reality. Every time Margaret smirked, every time Richard looked satisfied, I felt my resolve harden. They thought they were winning. That illusion gave me space to move. One evening, I casually mentioned to Richard that I was considering selling the car. I said it softly, uncertainly, like someone seeking approval. His eyes lit up immediately. "That would be smart," he said. "You do not even use it that much." Margaret agreed too quickly. "It is just practical." They did not ask where the money would go. They assumed that was the moment I knew I had them. The next step was legal. I contacted a lawyer using my lunch breaks, stepping outside the office so no one could overhear. My voice was calm, steady, controlled. I asked about tenant rights, marital property, and eviction protocols. I asked about documentation. I asked how long it would take to enforce my ownership if necessary. When the lawyer confirmed everything, my hands trembled. Not from fear, from power. They had built their dominance on intimidation. I was building mine on law. I began transferring small things back into my control, changing passwords, securing my mail, locking away personal documents. Every move was invisible. Every move tightened the trap. Then came the moment of execution. It started with a simple envelope. I placed it on the kitchen counter early one morning, knowing Margaret would find it first. Inside were copies of the house ownership papers and vehicle registration. My name was printed clearly, bold, unmistakable. I did not say a word. I watched from the doorway as her face drained of color. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages. The confidence she wore like armor cracked in seconds. Richard walked in moments later. His reaction was slower but deeper. He read, he reread, he looked at me. For the first time, there was no dominance in his eyes, only uncertainty. "You never told us," he said quietly. I tilted my head slightly. "You never asked." The silence that followed was electric. That night, I issued my conditions, calmly, professionally. Like a business transaction, they would stop interfering in my property. They would stop controlling my finances. They would treat me with respect, or they would leave. Margaret tried to speak. I raised my hand, not aggressively, simply final. This is not a discussion. The power shift was immediate, but I was not finished. Because revenge is not just about reclaiming control. It is about making sure control can never be stolen again. Over the next week, I implemented boundaries like steel walls. I locked my room, I separated accounts. I installed cameras in common areas under the excuse of safety. Richard knew what they really were. So did Margaret. Every step made them smaller. Every action reminded them that the game had ended. The final move was emotional. I spoke privately with Michael, showed him everything. The documents. The manipulation, the subtle ways his loyalty had been exploited. He listened in silence. When he finally looked at me, his eyes were wet. "They lied to me," he whispered. "Yes," I said. "And they used you to hurt me." That realization broke something inside him, but it also freed him. When Richard and Margaret realized they had lost Michael too, their power collapsed completely. Control without influence is nothing. The house changed. The air changed. Even the light felt different. I no longer walked carefully. I no longer spoke quietly. I no longer feared their presence. They had built their empire on intimidation. I dismantled it with truth, patience, and timing. And as I watched them retreat into silence, into restraint, into forced politeness, I understood something clearly. Revenge does not always roar. Sometimes it speaks softly, and when it does, it echoes forever. The day finally arrived when everything shifted in the most satisfying way possible. I woke early, the sun barely rising, painting the walls of the house with pale gold light. The air smelled of rain from the night before, fresh and cleansing. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes only before the storm breaks in full, irreversible force. Today, I would reclaim not only my house, but my dignity, my power, and my sense of justice. I moved with deliberate calm, every step measured. Breakfast was simple, almost ritualistic. I poured my tea, placed it on the counter, and glanced at the envelope I had prepared weeks ago. The final piece in a plan that had been carefully nurtured from observation, patience, and quiet fury. Inside were not just documents, but undeniable proof of control bank accounts, ownership papers, and letters from lawyers confirming the boundaries that could no longer be crossed. Margaret appeared first, smiling faintly as she sipped her coffee, but the smile faltered as her eyes fell on the envelope. She froze, the pen she held hovering over a magazine. The silence stretched. I could feel her tension like electricity in the air. She knew deep down that the rules had changed. I stepped closer, and with calm precision, I placed the envelope in front of her. "Everything you think you control is here," I said softly, deliberately, letting each word sink like a weight. "Read it." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the papers. Her eyes widened. The confidence that had once made her untouchable evaporated in seconds. She turned to Richard, a silent plea in her gaze. He was slower, but the effect was just as devastating. He read, reread, and then looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and panic. "Cannot do this," he whispered, his voice tight. "I already have," I replied, my voice steady, my gaze unflinching. The house felt alive with tension, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of paper echoing like applause in a theater. I could see Margaret shrink under my calm authority, her smirk gone, replaced by a tight-lipped panic. Richard's posture faltered. His usual arrogance had been replaced with unease, the kind that comes when a predator realizes it has been outsmarted. I allowed a pause, letting the gravity of the moment settle in. Silence is powerful. Silence is judgment. Okay. And silence allowed me to savor every second of their realization. I did not yell. I did not shout. I simply watched. And in that watching, I felt an almost intoxicating release. The weight I had carried, the frustration, the humiliation, the quiet erosion of respect began to lift. Every sharp glance, every passive-aggressive remark, every subtle manipulation they had used against me now reflected back on them, magnified by their inability to respond. Michael entered the room then, his eyes wide. He had seen the tension mounting, and now he saw the outcome. His expression shifted from confusion to awe, then relief. He approached me quietly, standing beside my shoulder. "You did it," he said. "Yes," I whispered, almost to myself. "I did." Margaret's hands shook as she held the papers, her voice barely audible. "This cannot be. You cannot." I leaned slightly closer, calm but resolute. "I can. And I did. This is not about revenge for its own sake. This is about justice. This is about boundaries. It's about respect. Something you have failed to understand for years." Richard looked at me, his jaw tight, his hands curling into fists that revealed more frustration than aggression. You are impossible," he finally said. I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. Impossible had become my armor. Impossible had become my shield. Impossible had become my sword. The microhooks of every slight they had ever inflicted flashed through my mind. each one now a stepping stone to this exact moment. Every time I had been quiet, every time I had observed, every time I had endured had been leading to this. And now the moment of validation was mine. I could see Margaret slumping slightly, the tension draining from her body as if she had been drained of all power. Richard stood rigid for a moment longer, then finally sank into a chair, defeated in a way that words could not capture. Their arrogance, their manipulation, their control, they had all crumbled before the quiet, methodical force I had become. The emotional release was almost physical. I could feel it in my chest, in my shoulders, in the way my hands unclenched, as if years of restraint had been lifted. Relief washed over me, followed by triumph, followed by a profound sense of validation. I had not just won, I had done so without violence, without chaos, without losing myself in emotion. My intelligence, my patience, my careful observation had been my weapon, and it had worked. Michael looked at me again, this time with pride. "Mom, you were amazing," he said. I held his gaze, letting the words settle between us. This was not only my victory, it was ours. The home we had built, the respect I had fought for, the authority that had been undermined, all of it was now restored. And in that moment, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, to feel the tension drain completely, to relish the silence that had once been suffocating. I understood that true power is not in intimidation, not in anger, not in fear. True power is in strategy, patience, and knowing exactly when to act. I looked at Richard and Margaret one final time. The house was quiet, the sun now streaming fully through the windows. The world felt sharper, cleaner, and finally mine. Their games had ended. My control was absolute, and I felt unstoppable. The storm inside me had broken, and in its wake only clarity, satisfaction, and triumph remained. In the quiet that followed the storm, I found myself thinking about everything that had brought me here. The humiliation, the subtle manipulations, the way Richard and Margaret had tried to dominate me, to belittle me, to make me feel small in my own home. It had been exhausting, demoralizing, and at times almost unbearable. But looking back, I realized that every challenge had been a lesson, a preparation for the moment I finally reclaimed my power. I learned that patience is more potent than anger. Reacting impulsively would have been satisfying in the short term, but it would not have guaranteed victory. True satisfaction comes from careful observation, understanding weaknesses, and waiting for the right moment to act. There is power in calmness, in quiet calculation, in knowing that every move is deliberate. I also learned the importance of boundaries. For too long, I had allowed their behavior to erode my sense of self. I had justified it to myself, believing that keeping peace was more important than asserting my rights. But peace without respect is meaningless. Establishing limits is not about punishment. It is about ensuring dignity, protecting oneself, and demanding acknowledgement from those who attempt to exploit kindness. Karma, I realized, does not always manifest magically. It can be subtle, methodical, and human. I created my own karma. I ensured that those who had tried to strip me of control and belittle me faced the consequences of their arrogance. I did not need to yell, to humiliate publicly, or to cause chaos. The justice I delivered was precise, undeniable, and lasting. Karma, I understood, is most effective when it is fair, calculated, and impossible to dispute. I also discovered resilience I had forgotten the first possessed. Enduring manipulation for weeks, feeling powerless, observing the quiet erosion of my authority could have broken me. Instead, it strengthened me. It forced me to think strategically, to anticipate their moves, and to prepare a plan that no one could ignore. Adversity, I realized, is not only a test, it is a teacher. It shows what is possible when one refuses to bend completely under pressure. One of the most powerful lessons came from Michael's perspective. Seeing his confusion, his hesitation, and then his awe when he realized the truth reminded me that strength is not only personal, it inspires those around you. By reclaiming control, I not only restored my dignity, but also reinforced the importance of integrity and courage for the next generation. Influence, I learned, is not about fear. It is about demonstrating that boundaries exist and that respect must be earned. There is no forgiveness here, and there should not be. Forgiveness implies that the harm done was excusable or temporary. Richard and Margaret's actions were deliberate, repeated, and harmful. They thought they could manipulate, dominate, and intimidate me without consequence. Their arrogance demanded correction, and I delivered it with precision. Forgiveness would have been a surrender. Justice, in this case, was far more satisfying. Now, as I move forward, I feel a sense of freedom I have not experienced in years. The house feels like my sanctuary once more. Every room, every corner, every object is a reminder that respect cannot be stolen without consequence. I walk taller. I speak with confidence. I engage with Michael with pride and understanding, knowing that we have both witnessed what courage and patience can achieve. This experience taught me to trust myself above all. When those around me doubted me, manipulated me, or attempted to control me, I had to rely solely on my instincts, my intellect, and my patience. Trusting oneself is not arrogance. It is survival, strategy, and empowerment. Without that belief, none of this would have been possible. I also learned that revenge is not always about destruction. It is about restoration. It is about reclaiming what is yours, reestablishing dignity, and showing the world or those who challenged you that power and respect cannot be taken lightly. The moment I saw the realization in their eyes, the collapse of their arrogance, I understood that revenge, when executed thoughtfully, is also a profound statement of strength. Finally, I realized that new beginnings are often born from endings. The chapters of life where we are mistreated, overlooked, or manipulated may feel endless at the time. But each ending contains the seeds of transformation. By standing firm, asserting my rights, and reclaiming my dignity, I did not just end a cycle of oppression. I began a new chapter of empowerment, self-respect, and clarity. Now, the future feels expansive. I am no longer afraid to assert myself. I no longer doubt my judgment. I no longer accept mistreatment quietly. The lessons, the victory, the release, they have all forged a new version of myself, stronger, wiser, and unafraid. And that, I realize, is the most enduring reward of all. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share in the comments a time when you stood up for yourself or reclaimed your power. And remember, patience, strategy, and self-respect are stronger than anger alone. Watch closely, because justice is always sweetest when it is deliberate, inevitable, and unforgettable.